World War I, or the War to End All Wars, was a global war that originated in Europe that lasted from July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918. More than 70 million military personnel, including 60 million Europeans and 10 million from other countries, were mobilized in one of the largest wars in history. World War I was the first war to have a widespread use of aviation, although planes were actually first used in Tripoli when Italy fought Turkey in 1911. The planes in the World War would obviously not compete with the planes we have now, but they did put up a good fight back in the day. The main plane for the Allies was a Sopwith Camel, single-engine, single-seater fighter out of Britain. The Axis used a Halberstadt CL-4, a two-seater, single-engine fighter known best for its ground attack. The development of tanks in World War I had been a response to the stalemate that had developed on the Western Front. Although the vehicles that had incorporated the basic principles of the tank had been projected in a decade or so before the war actually started, it was the heavy casualties that had been sustained in the first few months of hostilities that stimulated development. Great Britain, an initial vehicle nicknamed Little Willie, was constructed at William Foster & Co. during August and September of 1915. The prototype was a new design that would become the Mark I tank, and it was demonstrated by the British Army on February 2, 1916. On to World War II. World War II came right after the Depression in the 1930s and was the most widespread and deadliest war in history. It involved about 30 countries and resulted in more than 15 million military and civilian deaths. There were some estimates as high as 85 million people who died. Mustangs, Mitchells, Catalinas, Liberators, Corsairs, combat aircraft that were everyday companions to the U.S. Airmen in World War II and have become extraordinary treasures to many of the next generations. These aircraft had huge advancements to the planes that flew over the skies of Europe in World War I. For one, they were faster, 2, they were more powerful, and 3, they had longer range. These aircraft became known as some of the most popular aircraft in history. Prior to the entry of the United States into World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the Army only had a few tanks. But during the Louisiana maneuvers in 1941, it used trucks with the word tank painted on their side. The light M2 tank series was the most important pre-war tank. These light tanks were mechanically very reliable and had good mobility. However, they had a high silhouette and from the use of an air-cooled radial engine power and poor armor. Many planes were in the Vietnam War, but one of the most popular planes for the U.S. was the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom. It was a tandem, two-seat, twin-engine, all-weather, long-range, supersonic jet interceptor and fighter bomber. It was originally developed for the United States Navy by McDonnell Aircraft. It first entered service in 1960 with the U.S. Navy, proving highly adaptable, so it was adopted by the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Air Force, and by the mid-1960s it had become a major part of their air. During the Vietnam War, the troops began arriving in 1965. Operations crossed international borders that were bordering areas of Laos and Cambodia, and they were heavily bombed by U.S. forces as American involvement in the war peaked during 1968, the same year that the communist side launched the Tet Offensive. The gradual withdrawal of U.S. ground forces began as part of Vietnamization, which aimed to end American involvement in the war while transferring the tasks of fighting to the communists of South Vietnam. Despite the Paris Peace Accord, which was signed by all parties in 1973, the fighting did continue. Eventually, direct U.S. military involvement ended in 1973. In the early 1970s, various American design projects identified stealth, speed, and maneuverability as key characteristics of a next-generation air-to-air combat aircraft. This led to the request of information for an advanced tactical fighter known as the F-22 Raptor in 1981. F-22 Raptor is a single-seater, twin-engine, all-weather stealth tactical fighter aircraft developed for the United States Air Force. The result for the United States Air Force Advanced Tactical Fighter Program. The aircraft was designed primarily as an air superiority fighter, but also as ground attack, electronic air warfare, and signal intelligence capabilities. The M1 Abrams tank was named after General Creighton Abrams, a former Army Chief of Staff and commander of the United States military forces in the Vietnam War from 1968 to 1972. It is a third-generation main battle tank and is made of composite armor and a multi-fuel turbine engine. The M1 Abrams entered U.S. service in 1980 while ultimately replacing the M60 tank. The M1 remains the principal main battle tank for the United States Army Marine Corps and the armies of Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and Iraq. Three main versions of the M1 Abrams tank have been deployed: the M1, EMA-1, and the M1A2, incorporating improved armament, protection, and electronics. These improvements and other upgrades to in-service tanks have allowed this long-serving vehicle to remain in the front-line service. In addition, deployment of the M1A3 version was reported in 2009.